Okay, I'm really excited to talk about interleaving stages on pipeline parallelism in today's video. And we talked about the one forward, one backward schedule, which has allowed us to improve memory usage, but not the size of the idle bubble, not buddle. Anyway, you could still push this frontier. So just to remind you guys, this is the one forward, one backward scheme, wherein in order to reduce the amount of activation memory required, we will empty out the activations as soon as possible by doing the backward passes as soon as possible, which is to say that for the first micro batch, as soon as the model's forward pass is done, which is to say that the micro batch has gone through all of the 4 devices, then instead of the 4th GPU doing the last forward pass of the second batch, we're going to right away begin the backward pass on the first micro batch, as opposed to here where we wait until the forward pass is done for all micro batches. So going back to the interleaving section, this is what we're going to do in order to reduce the idle time. So up to now, we've sliced our model naively along the model depth dimensions, hosting, for instance, in a sequential manner, 1 to 4 on the first GPU, 5 to 8 on the second GPU. What would that be for the next one? 9 to 11 on the second GPU, and then 12 to 15 on the fourth GPU if we have 4 and 16 layers. But we can also slice it such that, for example, one GPU has all of the odd layers, another GPU has all of the even layers. And this is kind of a looping pipeline where a micro batch will move in circles from one GPU to the next as it goes to the forward pass in the model. And this is how it would work in a pebble graph. So this is an example of an interleaved pipeline parallelism for a model with layers distributed across 4 GPUs. The numbers correspond to the microbatch's IDs, but for clarity, we've colored differently the first and last layers of the model to illustrate how layers are spread across GPUs. So this graph yesterday took me maybe like an hour to understand. It was like incredibly frustrating. I think I just gave up, but then after basically debating with ChatGPT for long enough, I understood it, so I will explain it to you right now. So as it's mentioned here, these are microbatch IDs, but we know, okay, first of all, this is an 8-layer model, okay, with 4 GPUs. And how do you know it's an 8-layer model? It's because we have the forward pass of the first layers and the forward pass of the last layers. So just so that we're on the same page, the first GPU, if we have indexing from 0 to 15, okay, the first GPU has the 0 layer and the 4 layer. The second GPU has the 1 layer and the 5 layer. The third GPU has the 2 layer and the 6 layer. I'm just reading this off of my notes. And the fourth GPU has the 3 layer and the 7 layer. So microbatch 1 is going in on layer 0 on GPU 1, on layer 1 on GPU 2, on layer 3 on on layer 2 on GPU 3, on layer 3 on GPU 4, and then it loops back around for layer 5 on GPU 1, layer 6 on GPU 2, layer 4 on GPU 1, layer 5 on GPU 2, layer 6 on GPU 3, and layer 7 on GPU 4, and then we begin the backward passes. So there are, once again, 8 layers, and we interleave them such that each device contains 2 layers that are non-sequential. That is to say they're disjunct, or they're just not following one across the other. And as a consequence, we do have additional communications as the model goes several times through each GPU that previously just took one pass through each one. And this means that the communication is increased by V, but also each forward and backward pass of idle time is divided by a factor of V, where V is the number of stages or models, chunks per GPU, as we are better able to interleave forward and backward passes. So I'm going to derive this formula really quickly for you. So we have the total time that the GPUs are idling, which in the naive instance would be the total time for a forward pass and the total time for a backward pass times the number of GPUs minus 1, because in the naive case, only one GPU is working. So we have P minus 1 GPUs that are idling. But then now we divide it by V because we are interleaving. So I'm having a really hard time getting intuition onto why we divide by V here for the idle time. But ChatGPT says interleaving is like running V independent pipelines in lockstep. Each GPU never has to wait for the whole stack to clear. It moves on to the next slice of work, with the slice being V. And over V such many passes, your total idle time is 1 over V of what it was. So if you can get the intuition from this, then congratulations, because I cannot. And I've just been trying like quite a lot over the past 2 days to get this intuition. So perhaps I just have to give it some more time. But then the one thing that is not as difficult to intuit is that if we combine interleaving with mini batches, then the mini batch term does go into the denominator, because with a mini batch, what you have is instead of the GPU 1 sending in the first batch and then waiting for the first batch to come back so that it can do the backward pass, it can immediately send the second batch. So it's doing twice as much work, whereas it would just be idled otherwise. So this is definitely sensical, but when it comes to the V, the intuition isn't there for me. But we can now decrease the bubble anyways by adding micro batches and interleaving stages. But note that quantitatively, the amount of communication also increases by V. So even though we decrease the idle time by V, the communication increases by V since it's looping through the GPUs. And in this plot, we will see several configurations of pipeline parallelism with 8 GPUs. And the special case of M equals 1, V equals 1 is the naive pipeline parallelism mechanism. And the configurations with V equals 1 are all forward, all backward, or 1 forward, 1 backward. And anything with V not equal to 1 means interleaving, of course. So let's take M equals 2 and V equals 4 and explain what this means. M equals 2 means we have 2 micro batches passing through the pipeline, and V equals 4, this signifies that each batch sees each GPU 4 times for the forward pass and 4 times for the backward pass, and this is in a disjoint manner. So GPU 1 would have layers 0, 4, 8, and 12. If we assume that we split it up into 16 layers, the model, and then GPU 2 would have layers 1, 5, 9, 13, GPU 3 would have layers 2, 6, 10, and 14, and GPU 4 would have layers 3, 7, 11, 15. So we can see that we have the model segmented into 4 disjoint sets, such that the micro batches see each device 4 times in a forward pass and 4 times in a backward pass. And this allows us to have, in the words of ChatGPT, as if we had 4 independent pipelines. When we have pipeline parallelism, scheduling also becomes more complex, as we have to decide on a given GPU and at a given moment whether we are prioritizing early micro batches going through later layers, meaning that we close the forward and backward loops as fast as possible, which is called depth first. In other words, prioritizing getting batches out of the model as fast as possible, or if we prioritize to first have later micro batches going through early layers, so-called breadth first. In other words, prioritizing filling in the pipeline as much as possible. This choice is explained in detail in the nice paper here, and you now have all the elements to understand the pipeline parallelism approach in Llama 3.1, which is using 1 forward, 1 backward setup with interleave stages and a priority setting tunable between depth and breadth first. So let's read this caption, and this is okay, we can understand this, trust me. Pipeline parallelism partitions 8 pipeline stages, 0 to 7, across 4 pipeline ranks. So this means is that we have 4 GPUs, 0, 1, 2, and 3, and 8 pipeline stages. 8 pipeline stages means that every GPU has 2 layers, and there are 8 layers in total. But they're not sequential because we have interleaving, if I'm not mistaken. So there are 8 layers in the model, or at least the model has been split up into 8 layers. Okay, and let's see what it says here. Okay, the GPU with rank 0. So GPU 0 has stages 0 and 4. GPU 2 has, for example, stages 2 and 6, etc. And we have 5 micro batches, so 0 to 4. So the colored blocks 0 to 9 represent a sequence of micro batches, where M is the total number of micro batches, and N is the number of continuous micro batches for the same stages forward or backward. Our key insight is to make N tunable. So N I believe would be equal to 5, but I'm not entirely sure what they mean by this. One would have to read the paper to get a better insight into this. However, let's go through this and explain what each GPU is doing. So GPU 0 has layer 0 and layer 4, as we know. GPU 0 has stages 0 and 0, layer 4. So this means that there are 3 layers in between. So layer 1 to 3, which are owned by other GPUs. So we have this looping effect. So let's just go through the life of microbatch 0. I think this will be the best way to describe the life cycle of the batch within the pipeline. So I've done this already, but let's just do it once more because this is a technically different pipeline parallelism technique. So we have a microbatch 0 on GPU 0 in layer 0. Now we have microbatch 0 on GPU 1 on layer 1, and microbatch 0 on GPU 2 on layer 2, and the same thing for this device. But now this is kind of where it gets slightly more interesting. We have one time step where microbatch 0 is not even active at all because there are 5 microbatches. But then at this time step, we have microbatch 0 at layer 4 on GPU 0. And then we have microbatch 0 at layer 5 on GPU 1, at layer 6 on GPU 2, and layer 7 on GPU 3. And then now we still have it on layer 7 on GPU 3, but now it's doing a backward pass. Now we have it on layer 6 on GPU 2 for the backward pass. Now we've got it on layer 5 on GPU 1 for the backward pass, and then layer 4 on GPU 0 for the backward pass. And then we have to wait quite a bit for it to loop back. Now it's on layer 3 on GPU 3 for the backward pass, layer 2 on GPU 2 for the backward pass, layer 1 on GPU 1 for the backward pass, and the last backward pass through layer 0 in order to get our gradients. And the first microbatch, or the 0th microbatch rather, has gone through the entire pipeline. And you can do the same exercise for all other microbatches. It shouldn't make that much of a difference. So you can see here that we have achieved quite a bit of optimization, but we haven't reached the end of possible pipeline schedules, and some recent methods have been proposed to reduce the bubble to virtually 0. These techniques were, for instance, used in DeepSeek v3 and R1. And let's have a final quick look at these magical schedules before we leave the world of pipeline parallelism. So one thing worth noting is that in the DeepSeek v3 technical report, the authors indicate that their setup achieved a near 0 all-to-all communication overhead. So according to the authors of the Ultra-Scale Playbook, this is an ultimate flex. And let's get into zero bubble and dual pipe, And we're talking here about a 0 bubble regime. In essence, no idle time. The secret here is to split at an even finer grain level the operations involved in order to interleave them in the most efficient way. For instance, the pipeline implementation approach in DeepSeek v3/R1 called dual pipe reached close to a 0 bubble regime. And let's see how this can work by summarizing the 0 bubble work, which is a precursor to dual pipe by DeepSeek. The base observation in 0 bubble is that the backward pass through a matrix multiplication actually involves 2 separate operations, which is backward operation for the inputs B and the backward operation for the weights W. While the output of B, the backward pass of the input, is necessary for performing the backward pass of the lower layers, the backward pass of the weights W is not necessary for the rest of the backward pass and generally only needs to be performed before the optimizer step. And this can be seen in the following diagram, where during the forward pass, we get our input and our weight, and then this gives us our output, which passes through an activation function as the input to the next layer. And then in the opposite direction, when we have our backward pass, we have the partial derivative of the loss with respect to the output of this layer. And then we go through the activation function, which gives us here the partial derivative of the loss with respect to the weight, which is used to update the weight. But then we also get the partial derivative of the loss here with respect to the input, which is necessary to flow the gradient back towards the front of the network. This means that W can be flexibly scheduled anywhere after the corresponding backward of the same stage, and this allows for a strategic placement of W to fill the pipeline bubbles. The ZBH2 schedule on the top right, which is incorrect, is actually right here, is an example of a theoretical schedule with 0 bubble taking advantage of this fine-grained decomposition. So right here, you can see that it's quite filled up. There is actually still some idle time here, so I'm not sure why they said 0 idle. But anyways, you can see that you can get really fine-grained, and it's not really worth going through these examples, to be honest, because it's so convoluted in my opinion. But if you would like to become a pipeline parallelism expert, then you would need to understand this thoroughly. And then we have the 1 forward, 1 backward pipeline schedule, which we discussed already in the llama method that was right here. So this caption, once again, the classical F1 forward, 1 backward schedule is here, interleaving forward and backward passes, but keeping a coarse grained backward pass. And then on the bottom two, we have two variants of the zero bubble schedule, splitting the backward operation in a B and W finer grained operations. The last scheduled, so-called ZBH2, is an example of a theoretical schedule with zero bubble time, taking advantage of fine grained decomposition. Now let's move on to dual pipe by DeepSeek, which was introduced in its V3 technical report and is an extension of the decomposition approach to the additional case of two streams propagating from both ends of the parallel pipeline dimension, these streams being interleaved to minimize even further idle time in the GPUs. The schedule is displayed in the following scheduling graph and is even more complex than the previous ones. So apparently there's two pipelines happening in opposite directions simultaneously. I have no idea what's happening in this graph. So maybe from the caption you can tell it says there's a dual pipe scheduling for 8 GPUs and 20 microbatches in two directions. The microbatches in the reverse direction are symmetric to those in the forward direction, so we omit their batch ID for illustration simplicity. And two cells enclosed by a shared black border have mutually overlapped communication. Sorry about that. In general, fully optimizing such complex schedules involves carefully measuring the duration of the various fine-grained operations and solving a ILP, I don't know what this means, to minimize the final bubble time. See, for instance, the zero bubble paper for a discussion of the heuristics and algorithms to perform such a schedule. As a result, the zero bubble and dual pipe schedules are too complex for us to give here code snippets, but you should start to have a general idea of the concepts involved. And that's all for pipeline parallelism. In our last parallelism method, we'll be discussing expert parallelism, which is used in mixture of experts models. Thank you for watching.